She hadn't laughed in 3 years. Not a chuckle, not even a hint of a smile. Psychologists called her an impenetrable vault. But that afternoon, when the former Marine with oil-stained hands sat beside her on the cold floor of a weathered garage in rural Pennsylvania and told a story about the Iraq War that caught her off guard, she laughed and her world began to crack open. The rain hammered down on the corrugated metal roof of Harmon's auto like 1,000 impatient fingers, each drop adding to the symphony that Frank Harmon had grown accustomed to over his 27 years of ownership. Outside, the Pennsylvania countryside disappeared behind sheets of water, turning the October afternoon as dark as dusk. Inside, the garage smelled of motor oil coffee that had been sitting too long, and the comforting scent of old leather from the tattered workshop manual Frank had inherited from his father. Frank tightened the last bolt on the carburetor of a 1978 Chevy pickup, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision despite the arthritis that had begun to settle into his joints. At 58, Frank Harmon's face carried the topography of a life lived outdoors, creases around eyes that had squinted into desert suns, lines etched by worry during firefights, and a permanently furrowed brow from concentrating on engines for decades. His salt and pepper hair was cropped short, a habit he'd never abandoned after leaving the Marines. "Johnny, hand me that timing light," Frank called out, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who'd breathed in too much dust during sandstorms in Kuwait and Iraq. From the corner of the garage, 8-year-old Johnny Harmon looked up from his arrangement of die-cast model cars. The boy's eyes, Martha's eyes, Frank thought, for the 1,000th time, lit up at being included in his father's work. Johnny carefully set down a 1957 Thunderbird miniature and scampered across the concrete floor, his sneakers leaving small wet prints from where he'd been standing near the partially open side door, watching the downpour. "This one, Dad?" Johnny asked, holding up the timing light with both hands, treating the tool with reverence. "That's it, buddy. Good man." Frank ruffled his son's sandy brown hair. "Want to see how it works?" Johnny nodded eagerly, and Frank lifted him up to see into the engine compartment. As Frank explained how the timing lights synchronized with the engine's firing sequence, he felt the familiar pang of gratitude mixed with sorrow. Martha should be here for this. She would have loved to see Johnny's face light up at learning something new, the way her own face used to brighten at the smallest discoveries. 5 years had passed since Martha's battle with breast cancer had ended, leaving Frank to raise their son alone. She'd been a military nurse, tough as nails and twice as sharp. They'd met during his second deployment to the Gulf when a training accident had landed him in the medical unit with a dislocated shoulder. Martha had reset it with clinical efficiency, then surprised him by slipping him an extra pudding cup during evening rounds. Their love had been forged in the crucible of military service, tempered by multiple deployments and tested by civilian life, when they'd both finally hung up their uniforms. The radio in the corner crackled through "Tuesday's Gone" by Lynyrd Skynyrd, the sound occasionally distorted by the storm's interference with the ancient antenna. Frank hummed along, his deep voice harmonizing with the melody. Music had been Martha's domain. She'd known all the lyrics to every song on the classic rock stations. But after she'd gone, Frank had made sure to keep the radio playing. It was one of the many ways he kept her memory alive in the garage she'd helped him purchase after his discharge. "Dad, can we work on the Mustang after you finish Mrs. Peterson's truck?" Johnny asked, eyes hopeful. Frank checked his watch. "We've got about an hour before closing. I think we can squeeze in some time." In the far corner of the garage, partially hidden under a custom car cover, sat Frank's pride and joy, a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback Highland Green, just like the one from Bullitt. Frank had purchased the rusted shell 3 years ago, shortly after Martha's passing, when he'd needed something to occupy his hands and mind during the long empty evenings. The restoration project had become a bridge between him and Johnny, a way to connect when words failed them both. "I was thinking we could start on the interior today," Frank said, making a mental note to order the correct shade of upholstery for the back seats. The Mustang was more than just a car to him. It was a legacy he was rebuilding for Johnny, a tangible piece of American history they could share. The sudden flash of headlights through the rain-streaked windows interrupted Frank's thoughts. A vehicle had pulled into the gravel lot outside its high beams, cutting through the downpour. Not one of the locals Frank knew every truck and sedan in Oak Ridge by sight could identify, most by sound alone. This was something else entirely. "Looks like we've got a customer, buddy." Go ahead and start organizing those interior swatches for the Mustang. I'll be with you as soon as I can." Johnny nodded and headed back to his corner as Frank wiped his hands on a shop rag and moved toward the large bay door. Through the glass panels, he could make out the sleek silhouette of a Cadillac Escalade, midnight black and gleaming despite the rain. The kind of vehicle that usually bypassed Oak Ridge, entirely sticking to the interstate on its way to somewhere more significant. Frank pressed the button to raise the garage door, the mechanical groan joining the cacophony of the storm. The Escalade eased forward, water cascading off its polished hood as it entered the shelter of the garage. Frank noticed the Massachusetts plates and, more tellingly, the discreet MT logo on the driver's door. Morgan Technologies, the software empire that had revolutionized cybersecurity over the past decade. The driver's door opened and a broad-shouldered man in a tailored black suit emerged. Everything about him screamed security, the alert eyes scanning the garage, the earpiece partially hidden by close-cropped hair, the slight bulge under his left arm where a shoulder holster would sit. He looked absurdly out of place among the tool cabinets and engine hoists. "Are you the mechanic?" the man asked, his tone professional but clipped. Frank straightened unconsciously, falling into the stance he'd used when addressing superior officers. "Frank Harmon, this is my shop." "Sam Wilson, we've got a fuel relay issue. Car started making strange noises about 10 miles back, then the check engine light came on." The man Sam glanced back at the Escalade. "Can you take a look? We're on a tight schedule." "I can look, but parts for these newer models can take a day or two to arrive if needed," Frank replied, already moving toward the vehicle. Sam's jaw tightened. "We need to be in Pittsburgh by tomorrow morning." "I'll do what I can," Frank said, reaching for his diagnostic scanner. "You folks can wait in the office. There's coffee, might be a bit strong by now." Sam didn't move toward the office. Instead, he opened the rear passenger door of the Escalade, and Frank caught his first glimpse of the girl. She couldn't have been more than 17, with long dark hair that fell in carefully maintained waves over the shoulders of what Frank recognized as an expensive coat. Her face was striking, not conventionally pretty, but compelling, with high cheekbones and a delicate jawline that hinted at good breeding. But it was her eyes that made Frank pause. They were dark, almost black, in the garage's fluorescent lighting, and utterly vacant. Not sad, not angry, empty like windows into an abandoned house. "Miss Morgan will be delayed briefly. The mechanic needs to examine the vehicle," Sam said, his tone softening slightly. The girl, Miss Morgan, didn't respond. She simply stepped out of the car, moving with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions they'd rehearsed but found no joy in. Frank noticed her hands' long, slender fingers that looked like they should be playing a piano or violin, not clutching the small, leather-bound notebook she held like a shield. It took Frank a moment to make the connection. This had to be Elizabeth Morgan, daughter of Harrison Morgan, the tech mogul whose face graced the covers of business magazines and whose company's software protected everything from Pentagon databases to nuclear power plants. Frank had read about the family years ago, some tragedy involving the mother, if he recalled correctly. "The office is just through that door," Frank offered, pointing to the small room separated from the main garage by a glass partition. "It's not much, but it's warm." Elizabeth didn't acknowledge him. Instead, her gaze drifted across the garage until it landed on Johnny, still arranging his model cars in the corner. Without a word to either man, she walked directly toward the boy, her expensive boots making soft tapping sounds on the concrete floor. Sam made a move to follow, but Frank caught his eye and gave a slight shake of his head. Something told him to let this play out. Elizabeth stopped a few feet from Johnny's corner and simply stood there watching. After a moment, she lowered herself to the floor, carefully arranging her coat beneath her, and sat cross-legged on the concrete. She didn't speak, didn't smile, just sat and observed Johnny's meticulous arrangement of miniature vehicles. Johnny, who normally shied away from strangers, looked up at her with curious eyes. "Do you like cars?" he asked, his voice small but clear. Elizabeth didn't answer, but her gaze fixed on the 1957 Thunderbird model in Johnny's hand. "This one's a T-Bird," Johnny continued, seemingly unfazed by her silence. "Dad says these had the first backup lights as standard equipment." He held the model up for her inspection. "Want to hold it?" Frank watched, scanner forgotten in his hand, as Elizabeth hesitated, then slowly extended her hand. Johnny placed the die-cast car in her palm, and she brought it closer to her face, examining it with an intensity that seemed at odds with her previously vacant expression. I've got more, Johnny offered, pointing to his collection. I'm making a timeline of American automotive history. Dad helps me learn about each one. Sam cleared his throat, breaking the spell. Mr. Harmon, the vehicle. Frank nodded, tearing his eyes away from the strange tableau of the billionaire's daughter sitting on his dirty garage floor with his son. Right, let me take a look. As Frank connected his diagnostic scanner to the Escalade's computer system, he kept one eye on the corner. Johnny had resumed his narration, explaining each model in his collection to Elizabeth, who remained silent but appeared to be listening. It was the most animated Frank had seen his son with anyone outside their immediate circle of garage regulars. The scanner beeped, confirming Sam's assessment, a faulty fuel relay likely triggered by the heavy rain and electrical interference. It was a relatively simple fix, but Frank would need to order the part. Good news and bad news, Frank told Sam, who had positioned himself where he could keep Elizabeth in his sightline. I can fix it, but I'll need to get the part from my supplier in Bedford. Won't arrive until tomorrow morning. Sam's expression darkened. That's not acceptable. Surely there's somewhere closer. Frank shook his head. Not for this model, not with the aftermarket security system you've got installed. I'm assuming Morgan Technologies has some custom modifications to this vehicle. A flicker of surprise crossed Sam's face. How did you know that? Frank tapped the scanner. Readings are different from standard. Military-grade encryption on the computer system, if I had to guess. Makes sense given who you work for. Sam studied Frank with newfound interest. You know your stuff? 27 years fixing cars plus some time keeping Humvees running in Kuwait and Iraq, Frank replied with a shrug. I've seen a few things. While they spoke, Frank noticed Elizabeth had opened her notebook and appeared to be sketching something. Johnny was watching his model cars temporarily forgotten. Look, I can call ahead to Pittsburgh, have another car waiting, Sam said, already reaching for his phone. We'll leave this one here and return for it later in the week. Frank nodded. Your call. I can start the diagnostic work today, order the part, and have you back on the road by noon tomorrow. Sam stepped away to make his call, and Frank took the opportunity to approach Johnny and Elizabeth. As he drew closer, he could see what she was drawing, a remarkably detailed sketch of Johnny's 1957 Thunderbird rendered with precise, confident strokes that spoke of formal training. That's really good, Frank said quietly, crouching down to their level. Elizabeth didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence at all. She continued drawing, adding minute details to the Thunderbird's chrome trim. She's making my T-Bird fancy, Dad, Johnny said with a grin. Look, she got all the little parts right. Frank studied the drawing. It wasn't just technically accurate, it captured something essential about the spirit of the car, giving the small toy a dignity and presence it hadn't possessed before. You've got a good eye, Frank said to Elizabeth, not expecting a response and not receiving one. Johnny's been collecting these since he was 4, started with Hot Wheels, now he's graduated to the detailed historical models. Johnny beamed. Dad knows everything about all of them. He can tell you what year they changed the headlights on Corvettes and why the '64 Mustang almost wasn't called a Mustang. Frank smiled. Not everything, buddy. Just enough to be dangerous at car shows. For just a moment, Frank thought he saw a flicker of something in Elizabeth's eyes, not quite interest, but perhaps the absence of emptiness. Then Sam returned, phone in hand. We've got a car meeting us in Bedford 40 minutes from here, he announced. Miss Morgan, we need to go. Elizabeth didn't move immediately. She finished the line she was drawing, then carefully tore the page from her notebook and placed it beside Johnny's collection. Only then did she rise, brushing imaginary dust from her coat with practiced movements. Thank you for letting us use your garage, Mr. Harmon, Sam said, professional once more. Send the bill to this address. He handed Frank a business card with the Morgan Technologies logo embossed in silver. Frank pocketed the card. I'll call when the car's ready. As Sam ushered Elizabeth toward the door where a town car was now waiting. Despite the downpour, Frank noticed she glanced back once at Johnny's corner. Her expression hadn't changed, but something about the set of her shoulders seemed different, less rigid perhaps. After they'd gone, Frank walked over to Johnny, who was carefully examining the drawing Elizabeth had left. She didn't say anything, Dad, Johnny said, looking up. Not one word, but she drew this. He held up the sketch. It's the best drawing of a car I've ever seen. Frank took the paper, studying the precise lines and detailed shading. In the corner, in an elegant script that spoke of years of private education, was a small signature EM. Elizabeth Morgan, Frank murmured, remembering where he'd heard the name before. 3 years ago, there had been a news story: the wife of tech billionaire Harrison Morgan killed in a car accident on their daughter's 14th birthday. The daughter had been in the car, but survived physically unharmed. Frank recalled Martha commenting on the tragedy while folding laundry, wondering aloud what would become of the poor girl. Now he knew. Elizabeth Morgan had survived, but something in her had gone silent. "Can we keep it, Dad?" Johnny asked, already clearing a space on the corkboard where he displayed his favorite Carfax and pictures. Frank nodded, handing the drawing back. "Sure, buddy, it's a gift. Now how about we close up early and work on that Mustang?" As Johnny pinned the drawing carefully to the board, Frank couldn't shake the image of Elizabeth's empty eyes. He'd seen that look before on the faces of young Marines after their first firefight, the 1,000-yard stare that spoke of trauma, too fresh to process. But those men had eventually found their way back with time and the right kind of support. He wondered if Elizabeth Morgan had anyone giving her that kind of time and space. The next morning broke clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out overnight, leaving behind puddles that reflected the crisp blue October sky. Frank arrived at the garage earlier than usual, eager to get the diagnostic work done on the Morgan vehicle before his regular customers began arriving. Johnny was spending the day with Frank's neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, who watched him when school was out, a retired teacher who treated Johnny like the grandchild she'd never had. Frank had just finished brewing the first pot of coffee when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Expecting his parts delivery, he was surprised to see a town car pull up beside the garage. Even more surprising was the passenger, who emerged Elizabeth Morgan alone this time with no sign of Sam or any other security personnel. She wore simpler clothes today: dark jeans, a gray cashmere sweater, and leather boots that looked expensive but practical. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried the same leather notebook from yesterday. In her other hand was a cardboard tray holding 2 coffee cups from the artisanal cafe in Bedford 30 minutes away. Frank wiped his hands on a shop rag and opened the side door. "Good morning," he said, keeping his voice casual, as though billionaire's daughter showed up at his garage every day. Elizabeth didn't respond verbally, but she held out the coffee tray, offering one of the cups to Frank. He accepted it with a nod of thanks, noticing the neat handwriting on the cup: "Black, no sugar for the mechanic." "Thank you," he said, taking a sip. It was good coffee, far better than the bargain brand he brewed in the garage's ancient percolator. "I've ordered the part for your car. Should be here in a couple of hours." Elizabeth nodded slightly, the first acknowledgement she'd given that she even heard him, and glanced around the garage, her dark eyes seeming to search for something. "Johnny's not here today," Frank said, correctly interpreting her look. "He's with the neighbor when there's no school. Teacher in service day." A flicker of disappointment crossed Elizabeth's face, so brief Frank almost missed it. Then she walked over to Johnny's corner, where his models remained arranged in their careful timeline. She stood looking at them for a long moment, then turned her gaze to the corkboard, where her drawing was now prominently displayed. Frank sipped his coffee, watching her. He'd learned in the Marines that sometimes the best thing to say was nothing at all. After a minute, Elizabeth settled onto the floor. In the same spot she'd occupied yesterday, opened her notebook and began to sketch. Frank took this as his cue to return to work. He pulled the Escalade into the center bay and began the process of accessing the fuel relay, the familiar routine of mechanical work, allowing his mind to wander. He wondered what Harrison Morgan would think if he could see his daughter now sitting cross-legged on the dirty floor of a rural Pennsylvania garage, silently drawing in a notebook, while a middle-aged mechanic fixed her family's car. The incongruity of it struck Frank as he worked, occasionally glancing over to check on his unusual guest. Elizabeth remained absorbed in her drawing for nearly an hour, her pencil moving with quiet confidence across the page. Frank had progressed to removing the faulty relay when she finally stood and walked over to the workbench nearest his bay. Without speaking, she set her notebook down where he could see it. On the open page was a detailed sketch of his garage, not just the space, but the feeling of it. She'd captured the way the morning light filtered through the high windows, the organized chaos of Frank's tool wall, the dignified presence of the half-restored Mustang under its cover. It was the garage as Frank himself saw it, not just a building, but a sanctuary. "You've got a real talent," Frank said, quietly studying the drawing. "You see things other people miss." Elizabeth didn't respond, but she remained standing beside him, her eyes on the sketch. I was working on the interior of that Mustang with Johnny yesterday. Frank continued, nodding toward the covered car. It's a 67 fastback. Been restoring it for about 3 years now. Engine's done, bodywork's finished. Just need to complete the interior and detail work. He wasn't sure why he was telling her this, except that something about her silence invited confidences rather than demanding them. It reminded him of the way his unit's chaplain used to sit quietly beside troubled Marines, creating a space where words could come when they were ready. My wife Martha and I always wanted a classic Mustang. He continued, returning to the relay replacement. Never had the time or money when she was alive. After she passed, it seemed like a good project to keep my hands busy and teach Johnny about cars. Elizabeth moved closer, watching his hands work with the same intense focus she'd given Johnny's models. Frank continued his explanation, detailing the process of replacing the relay as though she were an apprentice learning the trade. She didn't ask questions, but her attention never wavered. When the garage phone rang, Frank excused himself to answer it. It was his parts supplier calling to say the delivery would be delayed until afternoon due to inventory issues. Frank thanked him and hung up, turning back to Elizabeth. Looks like we'll be waiting a bit longer for that part, he explained. You're welcome to stay, but it might be a few hours. I can call you a car if you'd prefer. Elizabeth shook her head, another small but definite response, and returned to Johnny's corner, settling back onto the floor with her notebook. Frank continued working on the preliminary stages of the repair, then moved to Mrs. Peterson's truck, which needed an oil change before she picked it up at noon. The morning progressed in a strange but not uncomfortable silence, broken only by the classic rock station playing softly in the background and the occasional sound of Frank's tools against metal. Around 11, the side door opened, and Johnny burst in, his face flushed with excitement. Dad, Mrs. Callahan had to go to the dentist for an emergency, so she dropped me. He stopped short when he spotted Elizabeth, his eyes widening. You came back. Elizabeth looked up from her notebook, and Frank saw something remarkable. The corners of her mouth twitched slightly upward, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one he'd seen on her face. Johnny approached her without hesitation, dropping his backpack by the door. I brought my new model today. It's a 1963 Corvette Stingray. Want to see? Without waiting for a response, he pulled a small box from his jacket pocket and sat down beside her, carefully opening the package to reveal a die-cast model of the iconic sports car. Elizabeth set aside her notebook and focused on the tiny vehicle as Johnny began explaining its historical significance. This was the first year they called it Stingray, and it had this really cool split rear window that they only made for 1 year because people complained they couldn't see out the back, Johnny said, pointing to the feature in question. Dad says sometimes the things that make something special are the things that don't always make practical sense. Frank smiled at his son's perfect recall of their conversation from the car show last summer. As he watched Johnny and Elizabeth, he was struck by how naturally his son had adapted to her silence. Johnny didn't seem to mind, or even notice that she never responded verbally. He simply continued his enthusiastic monologue about the Corvette's features, occasionally pausing as though giving her time to absorb the information. I'm going to add it to the timeline right here, Johnny explained, indicating a spot between two other models. Because historically, this was when American sports cars really started to compete with the European ones. Elizabeth nodded, another small but meaningful response. Then, to Frank's astonishment, she reached for her notebook, wrote something on a blank page, and turned it so Johnny could read it. Johnny's face lit up. Dad, she wants to know if she can help organize the timeline. Frank set down his wrench and walked over, curious. Elizabeth's elegant handwriting posed a simple question. May I help arrange them chronologically? Of course, Frank said, smiling at her. Johnny's been wanting to create a proper display. There's some balsa wood on the shelf over there we've been meaning to use for platforms. For the next hour, as Frank continued working on Mrs. Peterson's truck, Johnny and Elizabeth collaborated on a tiered display for his model car collection. Johnny chattered continuously, explaining each vehicle's significance, while Elizabeth arranged them with precise attention to historical accuracy. She wrote occasional notes in her book and showed them to Johnny, who responded with enthusiastic agreement or friendly debate about car facts. It was the most animated Frank had seen his son in months. Johnny had struggled to connect with children his own age since Martha's death, finding more comfort in the company of adults who shared his interest in cars and history. Watching him with Elizabeth, Frank realized his son had found a kindred spirit, albeit an unlikely one. When the parts delivery finally arrived at 1 o'clock, Frank almost regretted it. He installed the new fuel relay, efficiently tested the Escalade systems, and confirmed the repair was complete. As he closed the hood, he glanced over at the corner where Johnny was showing Elizabeth how to use a small hand drill to create mounting holes in the display board. "Vehicle's ready," Frank announced, wiping his hands. "Good as new." Elizabeth looked up, and for the first time, Frank saw clear disappointment on her face. She set down the drill carefully and reached for her phone, typing something quickly. "Do you need me to call someone to pick you up?" Frank asked. She shook her head and showed him her phone screen. A ride-sharing app indicated a car was already en route, arriving in 7 minutes. "I see you've got it covered," Frank said with a nod. "The bill for the repair will go to the address on the card your driver gave me yesterday." Elizabeth nodded, then returned to Johnny to help him secure the last of the models to their new display. Frank watched them work, struck by the transformation in Elizabeth's demeanor since yesterday. She still hadn't spoken aloud, but her body language had shifted, less rigid, more present. The vacancy in her eyes had been replaced by focus and purpose as she helped Johnny complete his project. When the rideshare car pulled up outside, Elizabeth carefully packed her notebook and pencils into a small backpack Frank hadn't noticed before. She stood brushing dust from her jeans and looked at the completed car display with what might have been satisfaction. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Johnny asked, looking up at her with hopeful eyes. "We could start on the information cards for each car." Elizabeth hesitated, then reached for her notebook one last time. She wrote something, tore out the page, and handed it to Johnny before walking to the door. She paused there, looking back at the garage as though committing it to memory, then slipped outside to the waiting car. Johnny stared at the note in his hand, a grin spreading across his face. "Dad, she's coming back tomorrow, and she says my car knowledge is impressive and precise." Frank smiled, crossing the garage to look at the note. The elegant handwriting read, "Your knowledge is impressive and precise. I'll return tomorrow at 10 a.m. if that's acceptable. Elizabeth." "Looks like you've made a friend, buddy," Frank said, ruffling Johnny's hair. "A very unusual friend." That evening, after Johnny had gone to bed, Frank sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, something he rarely did. His fingers, more accustomed to wrenches than keyboards, moved awkwardly as he typed Elizabeth Morgan into the search engine. The results confirmed what he'd pieced together. Elizabeth Morgan, 17 years old, only child of Harrison Morgan, founder and CEO of Morgan Technologies. Her mother, renowned concert pianist Sophia Keller Morgan, had died 3 years ago in a car accident on the evening of Elizabeth's 14th birthday. They had been returning from a performance at the New England Conservatory where Elizabeth, a musical prodigy like her mother, had played violin in a student showcase. According to the articles, Elizabeth had been in the car, but escaped with minor physical injuries in the years since she had withdrawn from public life completely. The most recent mention was a small piece in a Boston Society column noting that Elizabeth had withdrawn from her prestigious private school in favor of home education and had declined to continue her musical studies despite exceptional promise. There was a photograph from before the accident, Elizabeth at 13, standing beside a grand piano where her mother sat, both dressed in formal concert attire. The girl in the photo bore little resemblance to the silent young woman who had sat on his garage floor. The Elizabeth in the picture was smiling broadly, eyes alight with confidence and joy as she held a violin. Frank closed the laptop, troubled by what he'd found and what he hadn't. There was no mention of Elizabeth's silence, no explanation for why the daughter of one of America's wealthiest men would choose to spend her day in a rundown garage in rural Pennsylvania. Most concerning to Frank was the absence of any reference to treatment or recovery. Surely a man with Harrison Morgan's resources would have secured the best psychological care for his daughter. As he rose to turn in for the night, Frank's gaze fell on a photograph on the refrigerator. Johnny at 6 sitting on Martha's lap in her hospital bed, both smiling despite the circumstances. It had been taken just weeks before she died, when she'd still had good days between the bad ones. Frank remembered how Johnny had stopped speaking for nearly a month after Martha's funeral. No amount of gentle questioning or professional counseling had broken through his silence. What had finally reached him was the Mustang, the day Frank had brought home the rusted shell and asked for Johnny's help in making it beautiful again. His son had looked at the car, then up at Frank, and said his first words in weeks, "Mom would have loved this car." Perhaps Frank thought, as he turned off the kitchen light, Elizabeth Morgan was not so different from his son. Perhaps she too was waiting for the right restoration project to help her find her voice again. Elizabeth returned the next morning as promised, arriving in a rideshare car at precisely 10 a.m. She carried a larger backpack today, and when Johnny eagerly helped her unpack it, Frank saw she had brought professional-grade art supplies, colored pencils, fine-tipped markers, and heavyweight paper. For the next several hours, as Frank worked on a timing belt replacement for a regular customer, Elizabeth and Johnny created information cards for each model car in the collection. Johnny provided the facts, Elizabeth rendered them in artistic typography and illustrations that transformed simple car data into miniature works of art. The routine continued for a week. Each morning, Elizabeth would arrive at 10, sometimes bringing coffee for Frank or a new model car for Johnny's collection. She never spoke aloud, communicating through notes, nods, and the occasional text message. Johnny chattered enough for both of them, sharing car facts, school stories, and his dreams of becoming an automotive engineer, like the guys who designed the original Mustang. Frank observed the growing friendship with cautious approval. Johnny had bloomed in Elizabeth's presence, his natural enthusiasm finding a patient audience. And Elizabeth, though still silent, showed increasing animation in her gestures and expressions. Once when Johnny demonstrated how the Mustang's rebuilt engine turned over, Frank could have sworn he heard a soft gasp of appreciation from her. On the fifth day, as Elizabeth helped Johnny organize his collection of car magazines, Frank received a phone call that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Harmon's Auto," he answered, wiping grease from his hands. "Mr. Harmon." The voice was crisp, authoritative, with the polished accent of old money and elite education. "This is Harrison Morgan. I believe you've been entertaining my daughter." Frank's eyes flickered to Elizabeth, who was focused on cutting precise rectangles from cardstock for Johnny's magazine clippings. "Mr. Morgan," he acknowledged, keeping his voice neutral. "What can I do for you? You can explain why my 17-year-old daughter has been spending her days in your establishment." Morgan said, the slight pause conveying volumes about his opinion of Frank's garage. "I'm not sure I'm the one who should be explaining that, sir," Frank replied evenly. "Elizabeth has been visiting of her own accord. She and my son have been working on his model car collection." There was a pause, then a sound that might have been a suppressed sigh. "Mr. Harmon, I don't know what you think you're doing, but Elizabeth is under the care of specialists. She has been since her mother's accident. Whatever game you're playing." "No game, sir," Frank interrupted, his military bearing returning as it always did when he felt challenged. "Your daughter showed up at my garage, sits on the floor with my son, and helps him organize his cars. That's the extent of it." "She communicates with you," Morgan's voice sharpened with sudden interest. Frank hesitated, looking again at Elizabeth. "Not verbally. She writes notes sometimes or sends text messages." Another pause, longer this time. "Elizabeth hasn't communicated willingly with anyone in 3 years, Mr. Harmon. Not with me, not with her therapists, not with the specialists at the 3 private facilities where she's been treated." Frank absorbed this information, thinking of the elegant notes Elizabeth wrote to Johnny, the careful text messages she sometimes showed him when asking about tools or car parts. "I don't know what to tell you, Mr. Morgan. She seems comfortable here." "I'm sending Sam to collect her share," Morgan said abruptly. "He'll be there within the hour. This has gone on long enough." Before Frank could respond, the line went dead. He set the phone down, slowly troubled by the conversation. Across the garage, Elizabeth was showing Johnny how to create a border for his favorite magazine cover, her dark head bent close to his sandy one as they worked. Frank couldn't imagine this quiet, gentle young woman as the uncommunicative patient Harrison Morgan had described. Yet he'd seen the emptiness in her eyes that first day, recognized the signs of trauma that no amount of wealth or specialist could simply erase. For the next 40 minutes, Frank continued working on his customer's car, occasionally glancing at the odd pair in the corner. He debated whether to warn Elizabeth about her father's call, but decided against it. Whatever was happening between the Morgans was their business. His responsibility was to Johnny and the safe space of the garage they shared. At precisely 11 o'clock, the now familiar black Escalade pulled into the lot, and Sam emerged, his expression grim. Elizabeth, who had been in the midst of demonstrating a shading technique to Johnny, went completely still, her pencil freezing mid-stroke. Frank wiped his hands and walked over to meet Sam at the side door. "Morning," he said, keeping his tone casual. Sam nodded curtly. "I'm here for Miss Morgan." "I figured," Frank replied. He stepped aside to allow Sam entry, but positioned himself where he could intervene if necessary. "She's with my son." Sam's eyes found Elizabeth, and Frank saw a flash of genuine surprise cross the security man's face. "She's working on an art project. Model car display," Frank explained. "Johnny's hobby. She's been helping him with the design and information cards." Sam approached cautiously as though expecting Elizabeth to bolt. "Miss Morgan, your father has asked me to bring you home." Elizabeth looked up, and Frank saw the change immediately. The light in her eyes dimmed, her posture stiffened, and the almost animation of moments before vanished behind a mask of careful neutrality. She set down her pencil with deliberate precision and began packing her supplies. Johnny watched in confusion. "Are you leaving? We haven't finished the Shelby section." Elizabeth didn't respond, her movements becoming increasingly mechanical as she closed her backpack. Frank recognized the behavior from his military days, the shutting down that happened when a situation became emotionally untenable. "Johnny, why don't you show Sam the display you and Elizabeth have been working on?" Frank suggested, crouching beside his son. "I bet he'd like to see the 1970 Chevelle SS you added yesterday." Johnny hesitated, glancing between his father and Elizabeth, then nodded. "It's the one with the twin racing stripes," he told Sam, pointing to the model in question. It had a 454 cubic inch V8 engine that made 360 horsepower. As Johnny drew Sam's attention to the display, Frank moved closer to Elizabeth. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She remained still, eyes fixed on her backpack. "You're welcome back any time," Frank continued, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "This garage has been here 27 years. It'll be here tomorrow, too." For a moment, Elizabeth's hands stilled. Then, in a movement so quick Frank almost missed it, she tore a page from her notebook and slipped it under the model of the 1967 Mustang Fastback, the same model as the car Frank was restoring. "Miss Morgan, we need to go," Sam called, having extricated himself from Johnny's enthusiastic explanation of muscle car engine displacements. Elizabeth stood backpack clutched to her chest and walked toward the door without looking back. The emptiness had returned to her eyes, the vacancy that Frank had watched gradually fill over the past week now complete again. After they'd gone, Johnny turned to Frank, his young face troubled. "Did I do something wrong, Dad? Why didn't she say goodbye?" Frank wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. "You didn't do anything wrong, buddy. Sometimes people have complicated lives, especially grown-ups." "But Elizabeth isn't a grown-up," Johnny pointed out. "She's a teenager." "You're right," Frank acknowledged, "but she's dealing with grown-up problems." He nodded toward the car display. "Why don't you show me what you two accomplished today?" As Johnny began explaining their organizational system, Frank noticed the corner of paper sticking out from beneath the Mustang model. When Johnny moved to the next section, Frank carefully extracted the note. In Elizabeth's elegant handwriting were 7 words that made his heart ache. "Thank you for making me feel human again." Frank refolded the note and slipped it into his shirt pocket next to the space where he still carried Martha's wedding ring on a chain. Some messages weren't meant to be shared even with Johnny. That evening, as Frank was closing up the garage, a different black car pulled into the lot. A Rolls-Royce Ghost, its sterling silver Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament catching the last rays of the setting sun. Frank straightened instinctively, wiping his hands on his work pants, as a tall, distinguished man emerged from the driver's seat. Harrison Morgan looked exactly like his pictures in business magazines, tall, impeccably groomed, with silver-streaked dark hair, and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to command. His tailored suit probably cost more than Frank's monthly mortgage payment, and his shoes gleamed with the high polish of someone who had others to worry about mud and rain. "Mr. Harmon," Morgan said, extending his hand, "I believe we spoke earlier." Frank accepted the handshake, noting the man's firm grip and the slight calluses that suggested Morgan wasn't entirely removed from hands-on work. "Mr. Morgan, didn't expect to see you in person." Morgan's eyes, the same deep brown as his daughter's, surveyed the garage with clinical assessment. "I make it a point to personally investigate situations involving Elizabeth's well-being." The implied criticism wasn't lost on Frank, but he let it pass. "She's not here if that's what you're checking." "I'm aware she's at home with her caretaker." Morgan's gaze settled on Johnny's car display prominently positioned on a workbench. "This is the project my daughter has been working on." Frank nodded. "My son's a collection. Elizabeth's been helping him organize and document it." Morgan moved closer to the display, examining the information cards, with their blend of Johnny's carefully printed facts and Elizabeth's artistic embellishments. He touched one card, gently tracing the outline of a perfectly rendered 1963 Corvette Stingray. She was drawing again, he asked, his voice losing some of its edge. Every day, Frank confirmed. She has real talent. Morgan nodded slowly. She gets that from her mother. Sophia could have been a professional artist if she hadn't been an even more gifted musician. He straightened, turning back to Frank with renewed authority. Mr. Harmon, I'm sure you can understand my concern. My daughter is a vulnerable young woman with significant psychological trauma. She requires professional care and supervision. Frank crossed his arms, measuring his response. With all due respect, Sir Elizabeth seemed pretty content here. Not saying your specialists aren't doing their jobs, but sometimes people need different kinds of spaces to heal. And you believe an auto repair shop is such a space. Morgan's tone was skeptical, but not entirely dismissive. I believe any place where she feels safe enough to draw, communicate, and help an 8-year-old with his hobby is worth considering, Frank replied evenly. I was a Marine, Mr. Morgan. Saw combat in 2 wars. Some of the best therapy I got wasn't in the VA offices. It was in places like this, working with my hands, focusing on something I could control when everything else felt chaotic. Something shifted in Morgan's expression, a brief crack in the corporate facade, revealing a glimpse of a father's pain. Elizabeth hasn't laughed in 3 years, Mr. Harmon. Not once since the night her mother died. The specialists say she's experiencing persistent traumatic mutism complicated by severe depression. Frank thought of Elizabeth's intense focus as she helped Johnny drill mounting holes in the display board, the almost smile when his son explained why the 1969 Charger was his favorite muscle car. Not laughter, perhaps, but not emptiness either. Johnny didn't speak for a month after his mother died, Frank said quietly. No amount of counseling helped. What finally got him talking was this. He gestured to the partially restored Mustang. Sometimes the path back isn't through talking about what hurts. Sometimes it's through building something new. Morgan was silent for a long moment, studying the Mustang with newfound interest. The 1967 Fastback, Bullet Edition. Frank nodded, impressed despite himself. Original 390 V8 4-speed manual. Took me a year just to find the correct carburetors. My father had one, Morgan said unexpectedly. Not the Highland Green, he had the Acapulco Blue. Used to let me help him change the oil when I was a boy. His voice held a note of nostalgia that humanized him in a way his perfect suit could not. Frank sensed an opening. Johnny and I work on it every weekend. It's almost finished, just completing the interior and some detail work. Morgan turned back to the car display, his expression unreadable. Elizabeth's birthday is next week. She'll be 18. He paused, then added, the accident happened on her 14th birthday. We were driving home from her violin recital. The roads were wet. A truck driver fell asleep at the wheel across the median. Frank remained silent, recognizing the rare moment when a man like Morgan would share something so personal with a stranger. I was on a conference call. Morgan continued, his voice tight. Tokyo office. I switched cars at the last minute, took the company vehicle so I could finish the call. Elizabeth went with her mother in the Bentley. If I had been there, he stopped abruptly, composing himself with visible effort. When he spoke again, his voice had regained its corporate polish. Elizabeth will not be returning to your garage, Mr. Harmon. While I appreciate the interest you've taken in her welfare, she requires professional treatment, not amateur mechanics in model cars. Before Frank could respond, Morgan reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. For your time, he said, holding it out. Frank didn't take it. Not necessary, sir. Elizabeth was a guest, not a customer. Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly. This isn't a token, Mr. Harmon. This is compensation commensurate with the disruption to your business. No disruption, Frank replied firmly. My son enjoyed her company. No charge for that. Morgan studied him for a moment, then returned the envelope to his pocket. As you wish. He turned to leave, then paused. My daughter has seen 12 specialists in 3 years, Mr. Harmon. Psychiatrists with degrees from Harvard and Johns Hopkins. Trauma experts who've worked with war refugees. Art therapists, music therapists, equine therapists. None of them have gotten her to engage the way your son apparently did with his toy cars. Frank heard the question beneath the statement. Johnny doesn't expect anything from her, he said simply. He's just happy to have someone listen to him talk about carburetors and horsepower ratings. No pressure, no expectations, just sharing something he loves. Morgan nodded slowly as though filing away this information for later analysis. Good evening, Mr. Harmon. As the Rolls-Royce glided out of the lot, Frank stood in the doorway of his garage, watching until the taillights disappeared around the bend. Something told him this wasn't the end of the story, just the end of the first chapter. Inside, he walked over to Johnny's display and straightened one of the information cards that had been knocked slightly askew. Elizabeth's drawing of a classic car engine rendered in exquisite detail adorned the corner, bringing life to Johnny's carefully documented specifications. Frank thought of the note in his pocket, 7 words that spoke volumes about the silence in which Elizabeth had been living. Thank you for making me feel human again. He wondered if Harrison Morgan had any idea what his daughter had found in a rundown garage in rural Pennsylvania. Not a cure, perhaps, but a moment of humanity in what had clearly been 3 years of carefully managed isolation. As Frank turned off the lights and locked up for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that Elizabeth Morgan would return. The question was whether she would come alone or if her father would be wise enough to recognize that sometimes healing happened in the most unexpected places, even on the oil-stained floor of a small-town garage. The weekend passed with no sign of Elizabeth. Frank tried to maintain Johnny's routine, Saturday morning pancakes shaped like car logos, afternoon work, on the Mustang, Sunday fishing at Oak Ridge Reservoir, but his son's spirits remained dampened. Johnny checked the door whenever the bell chimed, his hopeful expression falling each time a regular customer entered, instead of the silent girl who had shared his corner of the garage. Do you think she's mad at me, Dad? Johnny asked Sunday evening as Frank tucked him into bed, the room illuminated by the glow-in-the-dark constellation stickers Martha had placed on the ceiling years ago. Frank smoothed his son's sandy hair back from his forehead. No, buddy, I don't think she's mad at you at all. Then why didn't she come back? We didn't finish the muscle car section. Frank chose his words carefully. Sometimes people have complicated lives, Johnny, especially people like Elizabeth. Her father, he might have different ideas about where she should spend her time. Johnny considered this, his young face serious in the dim light. Her dad doesn't understand about cars, does he? Frank smiled despite himself. I don't think that's the main issue, but no, he probably doesn't understand about cars the way we do. That's sad, Johnny declared with the straightforward compassion of childhood. Cars are important. They connect people. Frank thought of Harrison Morgan standing in his garage, briefly reminiscing about his father's Mustang before the corporate mask had slipped back into place. You're right about that, buddy, more than most people realize. After Johnny fell asleep, Frank sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, turning Elizabeth's note over in his hands. 7 simple words that revealed the depth of what she'd been missing. Not therapy or treatment or management, just the basic dignity of being treated as a person rather than a problem to solve. Frank understood that need better than most. After his second tour in Iraq, he'd come home with invisible wounds that no amount of VA counseling seemed to touch. The well-meaning therapist had labeled him PTSD, adjustment disorder, hypervigilance, cataloging his symptoms like parts in a manual. It wasn't until he had reopened his father's garage, feeling the familiar weight of tools in his hands and the satisfaction of fixing what was broken, that he'd begun to feel human again. He wondered if Harrison Morgan, with all his resources and specialists, had ever considered that his daughter might need the same thing, not another treatment protocol, but a place where she could simply exist without being constantly evaluated. Monday morning brought a steady stream of regular customers to Harmon's Auto. Mrs. Peterson needed her wipers replaced before the forecasted rain. Old Jim Halloran's Buick had a persistent knock that Frank diagnosed as a failing water pump. By noon, the familiar rhythm of the garage had almost pushed thoughts of Elizabeth Morgan to the back of Frank's mind. Almost. The bell chimed at 2:17 p.m. and Frank looked up from the brake job he was finishing to see Sam Wilson standing in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. The security man wasn't in his usual suit, but dressed in casual clothes, dark jeans, and a charcoal sweater that still somehow managed to look expensive. Mr. Harmon, Sam nodded, stepping into the garage. Frank wiped his hands on a shop rag. Sam, didn't expect to see you again. Sam's expression remained professionally neutral. Mr. Morgan asked me to deliver this personally. He held out a manila envelope. Frank accepted it cautiously. What is it? Information you should have, Sam replied cryptically. He glanced around the garage. Your son's not here. School day, Frank said, setting the envelope on his workbench unopened. He'll be at the neighbors until 5. Sam nodded, lingering instead of leaving immediately. After a moment, he spoke again. I've worked for the Morgan family for 7 years. Been with Elizabeth since before the accident. Frank waited, sensing there was more coming. Saturday was the first time I've seen her draw in 3 years. Sam continued, his professional demeanor softening slightly. She used to sketch constantly in the car during flights at her mother's rehearsals. After the accident, she stopped. Completely. Wouldn't even hold a pencil when the art therapists tried to engage her. Frank absorbed this information silently. Yesterday, she spent 4 hours in her room with the door locked, Sam said. When she came out, there were pencil shavings on her sleeve. He met Frank's eyes directly. I thought you should know that. Before Frank could respond, Sam turned and left the bell, chiming softly behind him. Frank stared at the manila envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings, medical summaries, and photographs, a dossier on Elizabeth Morgan that revealed far more than any internet search could provide. The earliest clipping showed Elizabeth at age 7 accepting a youth music award, her small hands cradling a violin nearly as big as she was. Another featured her at 12 performing with the Boston Youth Symphony. The most recent pre-accident photograph showed Elizabeth and her mother Sophia backstage at the New England Conservatory the night of the accident. Elizabeth was beaming, holding a bouquet of white roses, her mother's arm around her shoulders. The medical summaries were more troubling. Clinical language described Elizabeth's condition following the accident. Patient presents with selective mutism following traumatic event. Refuses all verbal communication. Minimal engagement with therapeutic interventions. Regression in self-care behaviors. Resistance to musical stimuli previously enjoyed. A handwritten note on Morgan Technologies' letterhead was clipped to the file. In precise angular handwriting, Harrison Morgan had written, "She was in the vehicle for 72 minutes with her mother's body before emergency services could extract her. The doctors say this is the source of the trauma. I believe you should know this context." Frank set the papers down, his stomach tight with the horror of what Elizabeth had endured. To be trapped beside her dead mother on her birthday for over an hour would leave scars no amount of expensive therapy could easily erase. The last item in the envelope was a current photograph of Elizabeth, clearly taken without her knowledge, sitting on the floor of Frank's garage beside Johnny, helping him arrange his model cars. It was the only image in the entire file where she appeared genuinely engaged with her surroundings. Someone, Harrison Morgan, presumably had circled the photograph and written a single word beside it. Why? Frank understood then why Morgan had sent the file. The billionaire wasn't just establishing his authority or warning Frank away from his daughter. He was genuinely baffled by Elizabeth's response to the garage and was seeking answers that his experts hadn't been able to provide. Frank carefully returned the documents to the envelope and placed it in his desk drawer beneath the service manuals and parts catalogs. The glimpse into Elizabeth's history had deepened his concern for the girl, but it hadn't changed his fundamental understanding of what she might need. Sometimes the deepest wounds required the simplest medicines, safety, purpose, and the dignity of being useful rather than merely being handled. The rest of the week passed without further contact from the Morgans. Johnny gradually stopped looking up expectantly when the garage door opened, though Frank occasionally caught him rearranging the model car display, perfecting the presentation as though preparing for Elizabeth's return. On Friday afternoon, as Frank was completing the week's invoices, his cell phone rang with an unfamiliar number. He answered with his standard greeting. "Mr. Harmon, this is Harrison Morgan." Frank straightened in his chair. "Mr. Morgan, what can I do for you?" "I've been reviewing Elizabeth's schedule and security protocols," Morgan said without preamble. "I understand that your son is not in school on Mondays due to teacher professional development days." "That's right," Frank confirmed, wondering where this was leading. "Elizabeth's birthday is this Monday," Morgan continued. "She will be 18. I've been advised that allowing her some agency in how she spends her time might be beneficial to her recovery." Frank remained silent, sensing that Morgan was carefully working his way to a point. "She has requested to visit your garage again." Morgan finally said, the words coming with obvious reluctance. "Her new therapist believes it would be counterproductive to refuse." "I see," Frank said neutrally. "I want to be clear, Mr. Harmon. I have significant reservations about this arrangement. However, as Elizabeth will legally be an adult, and as she has shown more initiative in this request than in anything else over the past 3 years, I am accommodating her wishes, provisionally. Frank recognized the tone, a commanding officer conceding a point while ensuring everyone understood he remained in charge. Elizabeth is welcome here, Mr. Morgan. Johnny would be glad to see her tomorrow. There will be conditions, Morgan pressed on. Sam will accompany her and remain present. She will return home by 3 p.m., and I expect to be informed immediately if there are any incidents. What kind of incidents are you expecting, sir? Frank asked, a edge creeping into his voice, despite his efforts to remain diplomatic. There was a pause on the line. Elizabeth's condition makes her unpredictable, Mr. Harmon. She has had episodes of distress in the past when her routine is disrupted. Frank thought of the quiet, focused young woman who had spent hours helping Johnny organize his collection, her movements deliberate and her attention steady. She seemed pretty stable here, Mr. Morgan, but I understand your concern. She'll be safe in my garage. See that she is, Morgan replied, his tone making it clear the conversation was concluded. Sam will bring her at 10 a.m. Monday. After the call ended, Frank sat for a long moment considering the implications. Elizabeth would be legally an adult on Monday, no longer subject to her father's direct control, at least in theory. Yet Morgan's arrangements suggested he had no intention of truly relinquishing that control, birthday or no birthday. Frank understood parental worry. He'd lain awake countless nights after Martha's death checking on Johnny repeatedly, irrationally fearful that he might lose his son too. But there was something more at work in Morgan's approach, a need to manage and contain that went beyond normal protective instincts. Frank glanced at the clock. Almost time to pick up Johnny from school. He'd tell his son the good news: Elizabeth would be returning on Monday. Johnny's excitement would be tempered by the revelation that it was her birthday, sending him into a flurry of planning what Frank knew would inevitably involve cars, art supplies, and probably too much sugar. As he locked up the garage, Frank found himself looking forward to Monday with cautious optimism. Elizabeth Morgan was coming back to Harmon's Auto on her 18th birthday, her first birthday as an adult, and the 4th anniversary of the worst day of her life. It was a convergence that felt significant, though Frank couldn't have articulated exactly why it so. Monday morning dawned clear and crisp, the October air carrying the first hint of the winter to come. Frank arrived at the garage earlier than usual, Johnny practically bouncing with excitement beside him. They had spent Sunday afternoon preparing Johnny, selecting his newest model cars to show Elizabeth. Frank giving the garage a more thorough cleaning than it typically received. Do you think she'll like the card I made? Johnny asked for the third time, carefully removing a handmade birthday card from his backpack. He'd spent hours on it, drawing a detailed Mustang fastback, surrounded by birthday candles with "Happy 18th Birthday, Elizabeth" emblazoned across the top in his neatest printing. I think she'll love it, buddy, Frank assured him, unlocking the garage door. Remember what we talked about, though. Today might be a complicated day for Elizabeth. It's her birthday, but it's also the day her mom died, Johnny finished solemnly. I remember, Dad. That's why I put the special message inside. Frank nodded, touched by his son's sensitivity. Inside the card, Johnny had written, "It's okay to be happy and sad on the same day. That's what Dad says about Mom's birthday now that she's in heaven." At precisely 10 a.m., the black Escalade pulled into the lot. Sam emerged first, scanning the area with professional thoroughness before opening the rear passenger door. Elizabeth stepped out, dressed in dark jeans and a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back in its usual ponytail. She carried her leather notebook and a small tote bag. Johnny couldn't contain himself. He burst out the side door, stopping just short of Elizabeth with the sudden awareness that she might not welcome a hug. You came back, he exclaimed, bouncing slightly on his toes. I kept working on our display. I added 2 new muscle cars and reorganized the import section like you suggested. Elizabeth's expression softened as she looked at Johnny. She gave a small nod of acknowledgement, then followed him into the garage, Sam trailing a few paces behind. Frank met them inside, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Morning, Elizabeth, Sam. He nodded to each of them. Good to see you both. Elizabeth met his eyes briefly, and Frank was relieved to see that the emptiness that had characterized her gaze during her first visit was absent. She wasn't animated, not by any normal standard, but she was present in a way that mattered. Johnny could barely contain himself. Can I give it to her now, Dad? He whispered at a volume that everyone could clearly hear. Frank smiled. Go ahead, buddy. Johnny presented his card with ceremonial gravity. Happy birthday. Elizabeth made this for you. Elizabeth accepted the card carefully. As she opened it, Frank watched her face closely, concerned that the birthday acknowledgement might trigger painful memories. Her expression remained composed as she read Johnny's message, but her fingers tightened slightly on the card's edges. After a moment, she reached for her notebook, wrote something, and showed it to Johnny. Johnny beamed. Dad, she says it's the best card she's ever gotten, and she wants to see what we've added to the collection. The tension in the garage eased as Johnny led Elizabeth to their corner, immediately launching into a detailed explanation of the changes he'd made to the display in her absence. Sam positioned himself near the door, maintaining a watchful presence while giving Elizabeth space. Frank returned to the Chevy he'd been working on, but kept one eye on the pair in the corner. Elizabeth seemed more comfortable today, her movements less hesitant as she examined the new models Johnny had added. She wrote occasional notes to him, each one sending Johnny into excited elaboration on whatever car fact she'd inquired about. Around 11, as Frank was finishing the Chevy's tune-up, he noticed Elizabeth opening her tote bag. She removed a carefully wrapped package and presented it to Johnny, whose eyes widened in surprise. For me, but it's your birthday, Johnny exclaimed, accepting the gift with reverence. Elizabeth nodded, gesturing for him to open it. Johnny unwrapped the package with uncharacteristic care, gasping when he revealed what was inside: a professional-quality hardbound sketchbook and a set of artist's pencils similar to the ones Elizabeth used. Wow, Johnny breathed, running his fingers over the sketchbook's cover. These are just like yours. Elizabeth wrote something in her notebook and showed it to him. You think I can learn to draw cars like you do? Johnny read aloud, his face lighting up. Yes. Will you teach me? Dad says I draw good for my age, but I want to make them look real like yours. Elizabeth nodded. Opening the sketchbook to the first page where Frank could see she had already begun a step-by-step guide to drawing a classic car in profile. For the next hour, the garage was filled with the quiet sounds of Johnny's concentrated efforts as Elizabeth guided him through the basics of perspective and proportion. Frank completed his work on the Chevy, called the owner to report it was ready, and started on an oil change for his next appointment. The peaceful routine was interrupted at noon when the garage door opened and Harrison Morgan stepped inside. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Sam straightened from his relaxed posture against the wall. Elizabeth went completely still, her pencil freezing mid-stroke. Johnny looked up in confusion, sensing the sudden tension. Morgan was dressed more casually than during his previous visit, dark slacks and a charcoal sweater that probably cost more than Frank's monthly utilities, but his commanding presence remained unchanged. He surveyed the garage, his eyes settling on Elizabeth and Johnny in their corner. I thought I'd join you for lunch, Morgan announced, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. It is a special occasion after all. Frank wiped his hands and stepped forward. Mr. Morgan, wasn't expecting you until 3. Morgan's smile didn't reach his eyes. I've adjusted my schedule. It's not every day my daughter turns 18. Elizabeth had risen to her feet and her notebook clutched to her chest like armor. Her expression had reverted to the careful neutrality Frank had seen when Sam first came to collect her the week before. Johnny, oblivious to the undercurrents, approached Morgan with his natural friendliness. Hi, I'm Johnny. Are you Elizabeth's dad? She's teaching me to draw cars. Morgan seemed momentarily taken aback by Johnny's direct address. Yes, I'm Harrison Morgan, Elizabeth's father. His tone softened slightly as he addressed the boy. You're the car enthusiast I've heard about. Johnny nodded enthusiastically. Yes, sir, I'm going to be an automotive engineer when I grow up. Elizabeth gave me this sketchbook for drawing designs. He held up the gift proudly. It's professional quality. Morgan's eyes moved from the sketchbook to Elizabeth, something unreadable passing across his face. Did she? That was thoughtful. Frank stepped in. Johnny, why don't you show Mr. Morgan your car display? You and Elizabeth have put a lot of work into it. Johnny eagerly led Morgan to the corner, where the tiered display showcased his collection, complete with the information cards he and Elizabeth had created. As Johnny began explaining the organizational system, Frank moved closer to Elizabeth, who remained frozen in place. You okay? He asked quietly. Elizabeth's dark eyes met his, and Frank saw fear there, not of physical harm, but of the careful equilibrium she'd established being disrupted. She gave a slight shrug that conveyed volumes. It's your birthday. Frank continued, keeping his voice low. And you're 18 now. That means you get to make your own choices. Elizabeth's gaze shifted to her father, who was listening with surprising patience as Johnny detailed the historical significance of the 1964 Pontiac GTO. Your dad's trying, Frank acknowledged. That counts for something. Elizabeth opened her notebook and wrote quickly, he wants me back at the treatment center in Boston tomorrow. Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. Is that what you want? Her pencil hovered over the page for a long moment before she wrote, I don't know what I want. I just know what I don't want. Before Frank could respond, Morgan approached, having extracted himself from Johnny's automotive history lesson. Elizabeth, I've made reservations at the Bedford Inn for lunch. Private dining room. His tone made it clear he expected compliance. Elizabeth glanced at Frank, then back at her father. She wrote in her notebook and held it up. Can Johnny and Frank come too? Morgan's surprise was evident. He looked from Elizabeth to Frank and Johnny, clearly recalibrating his plans. I had envisioned a family lunch, he said carefully. Elizabeth's expression didn't change, but her grip on the notebook tightened. Frank stepped in. Johnny and I have leftover pizza planned for lunch, Mr. Morgan. You two should enjoy your reservation. Johnny, picking up on the tension, moved to Elizabeth's side. But it's her birthday. We were going to put a candle in a Twinkie and sing the birthday song. Morgan's expression softened fractionally at Johnny's disappointment. Perhaps we could delay our reservation for a short birthday observation here. It wasn't a gracious concession, but it was a concession nonetheless. Frank nodded. Johnny, why don't you get the Twinkies from my office? They're in the bottom drawer. As Johnny scampered off, an awkward silence fell over the garage. Elizabeth had returned to her notebook, sketching something with quick, nervous strokes. Morgan examined the half-restored Mustang with feigned interest. Sam remained by the door, professional and impassive. Frank searched for neutral ground. Johnny tells me Elizabeth's been teaching him some drawing techniques. He's always been interested in design, but hasn't had much formal instruction. Morgan nodded stiffly. Elizabeth inherited her mother's artistic talent. Sophia could have been a professional artist if she hadn't been such a gifted musician. Elizabeth mentioned she played violin, Frank said, carefully steering the conversation towards safer waters. Played is past tense, Morgan replied, a hint of bitterness creeping into his tone. She hasn't touched an instrument since the accident. The therapists say the association with her mother is too painful. Frank glanced at Elizabeth, who had stopped sketching and was staring intently at her notebook. Sometimes people need to find their own way back to the things they loved, he offered, on their own timeline. Morgan's jaw tightened. It's been 3 years, Mr. Harmon. The specialists have tried every approach: music therapy, art therapy, traditional talk therapy, EMDR medication. Nothing has broken through until apparently your garage. The last words carried a mix of resentment and genuine bewilderment that Frank chose not to address directly. Johnny has that effect on people, he said instead. No agenda, just enthusiasm. Johnny returned triumphantly with a box of Twinkies and a single blue candle. Dad said we should wait for your birthday until you came back, he told Elizabeth. We got your favorite color candle. Frank wondered how Johnny could possibly know Elizabeth's favorite color, but the slight softening of her expression suggested his son had guessed correctly. What followed was perhaps the strangest birthday celebration Frank had ever witnessed. Johnny arranged a Twinkie on a clean shop rag, inserted the blue candle with ceremonial gravity, and used Frank's lighter to ignite it. Harrison Morgan, billionaire CEO of one of America's most powerful tech companies, stood awkwardly in a rural Pennsylvania garage while an 8-year-old boy led a slightly off-key rendition of Happy Birthday to his silent daughter. Elizabeth's face remained composed throughout, but as Johnny urged her to make a wish, Frank caught a glimpse of something in her eyes, a flicker of genuine emotion breaking through the careful neutrality. She closed her eyes briefly, then blew out the candle with a gentle puff. Johnny cheered. Even Sam cracked a smile from his position by the door. Morgan watched his daughter with an expression Frank couldn't quite interpret, concern mixed with something that might have been longing. Here, Dad brought paper plates, Johnny said, dividing the Twinkies. He handed one to Elizabeth, then offered one to Morgan with the unconscious confidence of a child who hasn't yet learned to be intimidated by wealth or status. Morgan hesitated, then accepted the modest offering. Thank you, Johnny. Frank watched in amazement as Harrison Morgan, dressed in clothing that probably cost more than Frank's monthly mortgage payment, took a small bite of a Twinkie in a gesture of paternal solidarity. The absurdity of the moment wasn't lost on Frank, but neither was its importance. For perhaps the first time in years, Morgan was meeting his daughter on neutral ground, participating in her chosen celebration, rather than orchestrating an experience he deemed appropriate. After the impromptu party, Morgan checked his watch. "Our reservation is in 20 minutes, Elizabeth. We should be going." Elizabeth looked at Johnny, who was happily finishing his Twinkie, then at Frank. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Thank you for the birthday celebration." "Anytime," Frank replied with a smile. "Happy birthday, Elizabeth." Johnny wiped cream filling from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Will you come back tomorrow? We can work on drawing that '69 Charger you were showing me." Before Elizabeth could respond, Morgan interjected. "Elizabeth has appointments tomorrow in Boston, important medical consultations we've had scheduled for months." Elizabeth's expression closed off immediately, the brief animation from the birthday celebration vanishing behind her familiar mask of neutrality. She packed her notebook and pencils with mechanical precision, not meeting anyone's eyes. Frank felt a surge of frustration on her behalf. Today was her 18th birthday. Legally, she was an adult who could make her own decisions. Yet Morgan was speaking about her future as though her newfound legal status changed nothing. "Mr. Morgan," Frank began carefully, "Elizabeth mentioned these appointments. I was wondering—" "This isn't an appropriate topic for discussion here," Morgan cut him off smoothly. "Elizabeth's medical care is complex and private." Frank held his ground. "I understand that, sir, but Elizabeth is 18 today, legally an adult." Morgan's expression hardened. "Are you presuming to advise me on my daughter's care, Mr. Harmon?" "No, sir," Frank replied evenly. "Just suggesting that Elizabeth might have some say in her treatment plan now." The garage fell silent. Johnny, sensing the tension, moved closer to Frank. Sam shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Elizabeth remained perfectly still, her backpack clutched to her chest. Morgan's voice was dangerously quiet when he spoke again. "My daughter has been under specialized care for 3 years, Mr. Harmon. Her condition requires ongoing professional treatment that I have the resources to provide. While I appreciate the diversion your garage has offered, let's not confuse a few afternoons of drawing cars with actual therapeutic progress." Frank felt his military bearing returning, spine straightening as it always did in the face of authority. He questioned, "With respect, sir, I've seen more engagement from Elizabeth here than you described seeing in 3 years of specialized treatment. That might be worth considering." Morgan's eyes narrowed. "You are overstepping, Mr. Harmon." "Dad," Johnny tugged at Frank's sleeve, his young face concerned. "You're getting mad." Frank took a deep breath, centering himself. Johnny was right, this confrontation wouldn't help Elizabeth. "Sorry, buddy," he said to his son, then turned back to Morgan. "I apologize if I've overstepped, Mr. Morgan. I only meant to suggest that Elizabeth seems to find some comfort here, that's all." Morgan regarded him coldly for a moment, then turned to Elizabeth. "It's time to go." Elizabeth hesitated, then reached for her notebook one last time. She wrote something quickly and showed it to her father. Morgan read it, his expression unchanging. "We can discuss this in the car. Sam, bring the vehicle around." As Sam left to retrieve the Escalade, Elizabeth turned to Johnny and gave him a small, sad smile. She reached into her backpack and withdrew a carefully wrapped package, which she handed to him. Johnny accepted it with wide eyes. "Another present, but you already gave me the sketchbook." Elizabeth nodded, gesturing for him to open it. Inside was a detailed scale model of a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback in Highland Green, the exact model Frank was restoring in the garage. But this wasn't a standard die-cast toy. It was a museum-quality replica with opening doors, hood and trunk, detailed engine compartment, and perfect interior upholstery. "Wow," Johnny breathed, turning the model carefully in his hands. "This is the most amazing model I've ever seen. Look, Dad, it's exactly like ours." Frank examined the model, impressed by its craftsmanship. "That's really something, Elizabeth. Thank you." Elizabeth wrote a quick note, "To continue your education." The Mustang represents American ingenuity and freedom. Johnny read it aloud, stumbling slightly over ingenuity, but grasping its meaning. "It sure does. Dad says the Mustang changed everything about American cars. It was the first pony car, Elizabeth smiled a real smile that transformed her face for a brief moment before the sound of the Escalade pulling up outside recalled her to her circumstances. The smile faded, replaced by her usual neutral expression. Morgan checked his watch. "Elizabeth, we need to go, now." Elizabeth nodded, shouldering her backpack. She gave Johnny one last look, then turned and followed her father out of the garage without a backward glance. After they'd gone, Johnny stood holding his new model, his expression troubled. "Dad, is Elizabeth okay?" "She seemed sad when they left." Frank crouched beside his son, choosing his words carefully. "Elizabeth has had a tough time since her mom died, buddy. Her dad is trying to help her, but sometimes grown-ups don't agree on the best way to help someone." Johnny considered this. "But Elizabeth is grown up now too, right? She's 18. That's an adult." "Legally, yes," Frank acknowledged. "But becoming an adult isn't just about age. It's about being able to make your own choices and take care of yourself." "Elizabeth could take care of herself," Johnny said with the confidence of a child who had decided someone was capable. "She's smart, and she can draw really good, and she knows all about cars." Frank smiled sadly. "It's more complicated than that, buddy. Elizabeth has been through something really hard, and she's still finding her way back from it." Johnny nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Maybe we could help her, like how you helped me after Mom died. You said working on cars together made both of us feel better." Frank ruffled his son's hair, heart aching at the innocent wisdom in his words. "Maybe so, buddy, but right now, it's up to Elizabeth and her dad to figure out what's best for her." As they returned to their work, Johnny carefully placing his new Mustang model in the center of his display, Frank completing the oil change he'd abandoned during the Morgan's visit, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that a critical moment had passed. Elizabeth had turned 18 legally an adult, yet she'd left with her father as obediently as a child, returning to a treatment plan she'd indicated she didn't want. Frank understood the paralyzing effects of trauma better than most. He'd seen strong Marines rendered passive by the aftershocks of combat, unable to assert themselves or make decisions in the civilian world that had once been their home. Recovery wasn't a straight line, and Elizabeth's path would necessarily be complex. Still, as he closed up the garage that evening, Frank found himself hoping that Elizabeth Morgan had found something in his humble garage that might help her claim her voice again, not just in notes written to an 8-year-old boy who loved cars, but in the larger decisions that would shape her future. Little did he know that the next time he saw Elizabeth Morgan, circumstances would test them all in ways none of them could have anticipated. 3 days passed with no word from Elizabeth or the Morgans. Frank tried to focus on the steady rhythm of the garage oil changes, brake jobs, tune-ups, but found his thoughts returning to the silent girl who had briefly shared their space. Johnny, too, seemed subdued, carefully arranging and rearranging his model car display each afternoon, paying special attention to the museum-quality Mustang that now occupied its center. On Thursday morning, Frank arrived at the garage to find a formal envelope wedged into the doorframe. Inside was a check for an amount that made him blink twice to confirm he wasn't misreading the zeros, along with a handwritten note on Morgan Technologies' letterhead. "Mr. Harmon, this represents fair compensation for your time and any disruption to your business. I appreciate your patience with Elizabeth's visits, but must insist there be no further contact. Her doctors strongly advise against continued distractions from her treatment protocol. The matter is not open to discussion. Harrison Morgan." Frank stared at the check, $500,000, feeling a complex mixture of anger and concern. Morgan was attempting to close the door on Elizabeth's connection to the garage with the one tool he trusted most: money. It was efficient, impersonal, and entirely in character for a man who believed every problem had a price tag. Without hesitation, Frank took his lighter from his pocket, held the check over the metal trash can beside his desk, and set it aflame. He watched the expensive paper curl and blacken the authorized signature, disappearing into ash. "I'm not for sale, Morgan," he muttered, dropping the last charred corner into the can, "and neither is your daughter's well-being." Frank didn't tell Johnny about the check or the note. The boy asked about Elizabeth each day, his questions gradually becoming less frequent as the week progressed. By Sunday, he seemed to have accepted that their unusual visitor wouldn't be returning, though he still carefully maintained the car display they had created together. Monday morning arrived with the first real cold snap of the season, frost etching delicate patterns on the garage windows. Frank had just finished his first cup of coffee when he heard the distinctive rumble of a high-end engine outside. Not the Escalade, something with more horsepower and less restraint. Through the frosted glass, he saw a sleek charcoal gray Audi RS7 pull into the lot. For a moment, Frank thought Harrison Morgan had sent another emissary with a larger check. Then the driver's door opened and Elizabeth Morgan stepped out. She was dressed differently. Dark jeans, a black turtleneck sweater, and a leather jacket that looked both expensive and practical. Her hair was loose around her shoulders rather than in its usual ponytail, and she moved with a purposeful energy Frank hadn't seen before. Frank wiped his hands and opened the garage door. "Elizabeth, wasn't expecting to see you again." She met his eyes directly, then held out a folded piece of paper. Frank accepted it, recognizing her elegant handwriting. "I turned 18 last week. I am now legally responsible for my own medical decisions. I've discharged myself from the treatment center in Boston. My father doesn't know I'm here. I need somewhere to stay while I figure things out. Can you help me?" Frank read the note twice, weighing the implications. Elizabeth was essentially running away from home, a home with a powerful, wealthy father who wouldn't take her departure lightly. Harboring her could be seen as interference, possibly even kidnapping, if Morgan pushed the legal angle. "Elizabeth," Frank said carefully, "this is a complicated situation. Your father sent me a letter explicitly asking me not to have contact with you." Elizabeth's expression didn't change, but her shoulders tensed. She took back the note wrote beneath her original message and returned it to Frank. "I understand if you can't help. I just didn't know where else to go." The garage felt safe. The simple honesty of those words, "the garage felt safe," struck Frank deeply. He thought of his own return from Iraq, how he'd gravitated to the familiar security of the garage when everything else felt chaotic and threatening. He thought of Johnny after Martha's death, finding comfort among the tools and engine parts when words failed him. "Come inside," Frank said, making his decision. "It's cold out here." Once inside, Frank poured Elizabeth a cup of coffee, which she accepted with a nod of thanks. They sat in the small office area, the silence between them broken only by the hum of the ancient space heater in the corner. "I need to understand what's happening," Frank said finally. "Your father said you had appointments in Boston, medical consultations." Elizabeth reached for her ever-present notebook and wrote rapidly, "It's a residential treatment center. I've been in and out of places like it for 3 years. The doctors want to try new medications, another round of intensive therapy. My father believes it's the only option. I don't." Frank nodded slowly. "And what do you want, Elizabeth?" She paused, pencil hovering over the page, for a long moment before writing. "I want to feel human again. Not like a problem to be solved or a condition to be managed. The garage gave me that. For the first time in 3 years, where I felt like a person, not a patient." Frank understood that feeling all too well. The VA doctors had viewed him as a collection of symptoms to treat hypervigilance, insomnia, flashbacks, rather than a man struggling to reconcile the person he'd been before the war with the person who had returned. "Your father will be looking for you," Frank said gently. "He has resources, connections. This would be the first place he'd check." Elizabeth nodded, then wrote, "I know, I don't expect to stay here. I just need help figuring out what to do next. I have money. My trust fund became accessible when I turned 18. I can pay you for your time." Frank shook his head firmly. "This isn't about money, Elizabeth. Your father already tried that angle." He studied her face, noting the determination in her dark eyes. "Do you have a plan?" She wrote quickly. "Not yet. I just knew I couldn't go back to being treated like a broken object. I want to try living on my own terms for a while." Frank sighed, running a hand through his hair. The situation was fraught with complications, both legal and ethical. Elizabeth was legally an adult, but her history of trauma and selective mutism raised questions about her readiness for independence. Harrison Morgan would surely argue she wasn't capable of making her own decisions, and he had the resources to make that argument stick in court if necessary. "Here's what we're going to do," Frank said finally. "You can stay at my house tonight. We have a spare room. Tomorrow we'll talk about more permanent arrangements. But first I need to make a phone call." Elizabeth's expression tightened with alarm. She wrote hastily, "Please don't call my father." "Not your father," Frank assured her. "A friend who might be able to help us navigate the situation legally. I want to make sure we're doing this right, Elizabeth, for your protection and mine." She considered this, then nodded her agreement. Frank stepped outside to make the call, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. His friend Marcus Bennett had served with him in Iraq before returning home to law school on the GI Bill. Now a respected attorney in Bedford, Marcus had helped Frank with the paperwork after Martha's death and occasionally provided free legal advice to veterans in the area. Marcus picked up on the third ring. "Frank Harmon, haven't heard from you in months. Let me guess Johnny finally convinced you to let him drive the Mustang, and you need bail money." Frank smiled despite the circumstances. "Not quite that dire, but I do need your expertise. How much do you know about medical autonomy for young adults with psychiatric histories?" There was a pause on the line. "Frank, what have you gotten yourself into?" 20 minutes later, Frank had explained the situation in as much detail as he could without violating Elizabeth's privacy. Marcus's response was measured but concerned. "Legally, she's an adult. She can refuse treatment and make her own decisions." "But Frank, this is Harrison Morgan we're talking about. He doesn't just have money, he has influence connections all the way to Washington. If he believes his daughter is in danger or incapable of making sound decisions, he could petition for guardianship or involuntary commitment." "She seems lucid to me," Frank countered. "Traumatized, yes. Silent, yes. But not incapable of making decisions." "The court might see it differently, especially with her history," Marcus warned. "The fact that she doesn't speak at all would be a significant factor in any competency hearing." Frank watched through the garage window as Elizabeth sat quietly in his office, her hands cradling the coffee mug, gaze fixed on nothing in particular. "So what do we do?" Marcus sighed. "If you want my legal advice, call Morgan and tell him his daughter is safe. Try to arrange a meeting in neutral ground with her consent. Document everything, her communications, her stated wishes, her apparent mental state. If this goes south, you'll need evidence that you are acting in good faith. And if it doesn't go south, then you help a young woman find her voice again in whatever form that takes," Marcus said quietly. "Just be careful, Frank. This isn't like pulling a buddy out of a firefight. The battlefield here has different rules." After ending the call, Frank returned to the office where Elizabeth waited. "My friend is an attorney," he explained. "He says legally you have the right to make your own decisions now, but he's concerned about how your father might respond." Elizabeth nodded, unsurprised. She wrote in her notebook, "My father will try to prove I'm incompetent, that I need guardianship." "That's what Marcus thinks too," Frank confirmed. "He suggested I contact your father, let him know you're safe." Elizabeth's expression hardened. She wrote rapidly, "If you tell him where I am, I'll leave immediately. I won't go back." Frank held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not suggesting sending you back, Elizabeth, but disappearing completely will only escalate the situation. Your father is likely already looking for you. If he involves the police, things could get complicated quickly." She considered this, then wrote, "One day, give me one day to think, then we can contact him." Frank nodded, accepting the compromise. "All right, one day. In the meantime, I need to open the garage and call Johnny's school. He stayed home with a cold today, but Mrs. Callahan is checking on him." As if on cue, the phone rang. Frank answered to find his elderly neighbor on the line, her voice apologetic. "Frank, I'm so sorry, but my sister's had a fall in Pittsburgh. I need to go to her right away. Johnny's fever is down, but he still shouldn't be alone." "Don't worry about it, Alice," Frank assured her. "I can bring him to the garage. You take care of your sister." After hanging up, Frank explained the situation to Elizabeth. "I need to go get Johnny. He's got a mild cold, nothing serious, but he can't stay home alone. He'll be excited to see you." Elizabeth nodded, a hint of warmth entering her expression at the mention of Johnny. "Will you be okay here for about 20 minutes? Help yourself to more coffee if you want." She wrote quickly, "I'll be fine, thank you, Frank." The drive to his house took less than 10 minutes. Frank found Johnny in his pajamas on the couch watching a documentary about classic muscle cars and looking considerably better than he had that morning. "Hey, buddy, feeling better?" Johnny nodded, muting the TV. "My throat doesn't hurt anymore. Can I come to the garage with you?" Mrs. Callahan had to leave. "That's the plan," Frank confirmed, gathering Johnny's medications and a change of clothes. "And there's someone at the garage who'll be happy to see you." Johnny's eyes widened. "Elizabeth came back." Frank nodded, choosing his words carefully. "She did. She needs our help for a little while. She might be staying with us for a day or two." "Is she okay?" Johnny asked, suddenly serious. "Did something bad happen?" Frank helped his son into a warm sweater. Elizabeth is going through a tough time with her dad right now. She needs a safe place to figure things out. I told her she could stay in our guest room tonight. Johnny considered this information with the gravity of a child who had faced his own share of difficult situations. Like when Kevin from my class stayed with his grandma when his parents were fighting. Something like that, Frank agreed, relieved by his son's matter-of-fact acceptance. Now let's get your medicine and head to the garage. But when they arrived back at Harmon's auto, Frank was alarmed to see a familiar black Escalade parked beside Elizabeth's Audi. Inside the garage, Sam Wilson stood near the door while Elizabeth sat rigid in Frank's office chair, her notebook clutched to her chest. Johnny rushed forward. "Elizabeth, you came back." Elizabeth's expression softened at the sight of Johnny, though her posture remained tense. She gave him a small nod of greeting. Frank approached Sam, keeping his voice low. "How did you find her so quickly?" Sam's professional demeanor was firmly in place, but Frank detected a hint of discomfort in his stance. "The car has GPS tracking, standard security protocol for all family vehicles." "Does Morgan know she's here?" Sam nodded. "He's on his way from Boston. ETA approximately 40 minutes. Frank processed this information, glancing at Elizabeth, who was showing Johnny something in her notebook, while keeping a wary eye on the adult's conversation. "What's your role in this, Sam?" Frank asked directly. "Are you here to take her back by force?" Something like offense flashed across Sam's face. "I'm here to ensure Miss Morgan's safety as always. She left the facility without notifying anyone." Mr. Morgan was concerned. "She's 18, Frank pointed out. Legally an adult. Mr. Morgan is aware of her legal status." Sam replied carefully. "He's also aware of her medical history and the recommendations of her treatment team." Frank studied the security man, sensing there was more to his position than professional duty. "You've been with her for years, right? Since before the accident?" Sam nodded once, his expression guarded. "In your professional assessment, is Elizabeth in immediate danger from herself or others?" Sam hesitated, glancing at Elizabeth, who was now helping Johnny organize a section of his model car, display her movements calm and purposeful. "No," he admitted finally. "But Mr. Morgan believes—" "I'm not asking what Morgan believes," Frank interrupted. "I'm asking for your assessment. You've spent more time with Elizabeth than anyone since the accident. Is she incapable of making her own decisions?" Sam's professional mask slipped slightly. "It's not that simple, Mr. Harmon. Elizabeth's condition is complex. There are good days and bad days. And today, is this a good day or a bad day?" Sam watched as Elizabeth carefully adjusted the position of a model car, following Johnny's animated instructions. "Today appears to be a good day." Frank nodded, sensing an unexpected ally. "When Morgan arrives, I'd appreciate it if you'd share that assessment with him." Sam didn't commit either way, but his silence wasn't a refusal. He returned to his position near the door, maintaining his vigilance, while giving Elizabeth and Johnny space. For the next half hour, the garage existed in a strange limbo. Frank attended to a scheduled oil change, keeping one eye on Elizabeth and Johnny as they worked on reorganizing his model collection. Sam remained by the door, occasionally checking his phone, but otherwise motionless. No one mentioned the impending arrival of Harrison Morgan, though the knowledge of it hung in the air like the scent before a storm. At precisely 11:42 a.m., a black Rolls-Royce Ghost pulled into the lot, its sterling silver Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament catching the late morning sunlight. Harrison Morgan emerged dressed for battle in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that projected authority and control. His face was a mask of contained fury as he entered the garage. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice tight with restrained emotion, "this is completely unacceptable." Elizabeth didn't look up from the model car she was examining with Johnny. Her hands trembled slightly, but her posture remained defiant in its stillness. Morgan turned his attention to Frank. "Mr. Harmon, I thought I made myself clear in my letter." "You did," Frank acknowledged, wiping his hands on a shop rag as he approached. "But Elizabeth came here of her own accord. As an adult, that's her right." Morgan's expression hardened. "My daughter is not capable of making rational decisions about her care. Her doctors have been explicit about this. By harboring her, you are interfering with necessary medical treatment." "I'm not harboring anyone," Frank replied evenly. "Elizabeth arrived this morning. She asked for help. I offered her a safe place to stay while she figures out her next steps." There are no next steps to figure out, Morgan snapped. Elizabeth's treatment plan is comprehensive and carefully managed by experts who understand her condition. This, he gestured dismissively at the garage, is a disruption that could set her back months. Johnny, sensing the tension, moved closer to Elizabeth, his young face concerned. Are you okay? He whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Elizabeth nodded, giving Johnny a small, reassuring smile before turning her attention back to Morgan. She opened her notebook, wrote something, and held it up for her father to read. Morgan's jaw tightened as he read her message. This is not up for discussion, Elizabeth. The doctors have been clear about the risks of interrupting your treatment. I've arranged for a new facility in Vermont, smaller, more personalized. You'll be more comfortable there. Elizabeth wrote again more forcefully and showed it to her father. You are not thinking clearly, Morgan insisted, his voice rising slightly. This is exactly why you need continued treatment. These impulsive decisions. Mr. Morgan, Frank interjected, stepping forward. Perhaps we could discuss this calmly. Elizabeth has expressed some concerns about her treatment plan that deserve consideration. Morgan turned on him, eyes flashing. You have no standing in this discussion, Mr. Harmon. You are not family. You are not a medical professional. You are a mechanic who has, for reasons I cannot fathom, inserted yourself into a situation you don't understand. Frank held his ground. I understand that Elizabeth is 18 years old, legally an adult, and has the right to make her own medical decisions. I understand that she's communicating clearly through writing, even if she doesn't speak aloud. And I understand that forcing her back into a treatment program she doesn't want will only reinforce the trauma she's already experienced. Morgan's face flushed with anger. You dare to lecture me about my daughter's trauma. I have spent 3 years and millions of dollars seeking the best care possible for Elizabeth. I have consulted specialists across the country. I have rearranged my entire life to ensure she receives the treatment she needs. And in those 3 years, Frank asked quietly, how often did you ask Elizabeth what she needed? The garage fell silent. Johnny pressed closer to Elizabeth, instinctively offering comfort. Sam shifted his weight, his professional neutrality slipping as he watched the confrontation unfold. And Elizabeth stared at her father with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the careful facade of control he maintained. Morgan broke the silence first, his voice dangerously quiet. Sam, escort Elizabeth to the car. We're leaving. Sam hesitated, glancing between Morgan and Elizabeth. Sir, perhaps we should... That was not a request. Morgan cut him off. Elizabeth needs to return to medical supervision immediately. This situation has gone on long enough. Sam moved reluctantly toward Elizabeth, who remained seated beside Johnny. Miss Morgan, please come with me. Elizabeth shook her head firmly, one arm protectively around Johnny's shoulders. Elizabeth, Morgan's voice took on a warning tone. You are making a scene. This behavior is exactly why your doctors recommend continued residential treatment. Something shifted in Elizabeth's expression, a hardening of resolve that transformed her features. She stood slowly, her notebook clutched in one hand, and faced her father directly. No. The word hung in the air, simple and unmistakable. Elizabeth's voice was hoarse from disuse, but clear enough that everyone in the garage froze in shock. Morgan stared at his daughter as though she'd suddenly transformed into a stranger. Elizabeth. No. She repeated the single syllable, stronger this time. I won't go. Frank felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. Elizabeth's speaking was a breakthrough, but it had come in a moment of extreme stress. He moved closer, ready to intervene if the situation escalated further. Morgan seemed genuinely shaken by his daughter's voice after 3 years of silence. Elizabeth, you're not thinking clearly. The doctor said, I don't care what they said. Elizabeth's voice cracked with the effort of speaking after so long, but her words were distinct. 3 years, Dad. 3 years of being treated like a broken doll, of being medicated until I couldn't feel anything, of being talked about instead of talked to. Morgan took a step back, visibly struggling to process his daughter's sudden verbalization. You're speaking, he said unnecessarily, his composure slipping. How when... She's been ready for a while, Sam said quietly from his position near the door. The doctors said it was psychological, not physical. She needed the right trigger. Morgan turned to his security chief, betrayal flashing across his face. You knew... Sam shook his head. I suspected. She's been different since visiting this garage, more present, more herself. Elizabeth took a deep breath as though gathering strength for what came next. I'm not going back to any facility, she said, each word deliberate and clear, despite her rusty voice. I'm 18. I get to decide what happens to me now. Morgan's shock was giving way to renewed determination. You're not well, Elizabeth. This moment of lucidity doesn't erase 3 years of treatment history. The doctors have been clear about the risks of interrupting your care. The doctors don't know me, Elizabeth countered, her voice gaining strength with each word. They know my file. They know my symptoms. They don't know me. Johnny, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. Elizabeth is smart, Mr. Morgan. She helps me with my cars and teaches me to draw. She's not broken. Morgan glanced down at the boy, momentarily thrown off balance by the simple defense. Before he could respond, Frank stepped forward. Mr. Morgan, I think we all need to take a breath here. Elizabeth is speaking, actually speaking for the first time in 3 years. That's significant. Maybe instead of arguing about treatment facilities, we should listen to what she has to say. Morgan's jaw worked as he visibly struggled with his instinct to take control of the situation. Finally, he turned to Elizabeth, making a visible effort to soften his approach. All right, Elizabeth, I'm listening. What is it you want? Elizabeth met her father's gaze directly. I want to live on my own terms for a while. Not as a patient, not as a project, just as a person. Her voice was growing steadier with practice, though still raspy from years of disuse. I have my trust fund now. I can support myself. And where would you live? Morgan challenged. What would you do? You haven't finished your education. You have no job experience, no practical skills for independent living. I can learn, Elizabeth insisted. People do it every day. Not people in your situation, Morgan countered. Not people who have been through what you've experienced. Frank saw the opening and took it. What if there was a middle ground? Both Morgans turned to look at him. Elizabeth with cautious hope, Harrison with guarded skepticism. Elizabeth needs space to reclaim her independence, Frank continued. But I understand your concerns about her jumping straight into completely independent living, Mr. Morgan. What if there was a transitional arrangement, a supervised living situation that isn't a treatment facility? Morgan's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Harmon? Frank hadn't fully formed the idea before speaking, but as he considered it, the solution seemed increasingly obvious. The apartment above my garage, its small but functional kitchen, bathroom, living area, bedroom. It's been empty since my father-in-law moved to Florida last year. Elizabeth's eyes widened with interest. Above this garage, Frank nodded. It would give you independence, but with support nearby if needed. You'd be close enough that Johnny and I could check on you, but have your own space. You could even help in the garage if you wanted, learn some practical skills. Morgan was already shaking his head. Absolutely not. Elizabeth needs proper supervision by qualified professionals, not a mechanic and an 8-year-old boy. Dad, Elizabeth's voice cut through his objections, the single syllable carrying the weight of 3 years of silence. Please, just listen. Something in her tone, perhaps the simple fact that she was speaking at all, gave Morgan pause. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. This place, Elizabeth continued carefully, each word measured, makes me feel human again. Not like a case study, not like a problem, just human. The garage fell silent as Morgan absorbed his daughter's words. Frank could almost see the internal struggle playing out across the billionaire's face, the instinct to control warring with the undeniable evidence that his daughter had found something here that years of expensive treatment hadn't provided. It's not safe, Morgan said finally, but his tone had lost its certainty. This is a commercial area. There are strangers coming and going all day. The apartment has its own entrance around the back, Frank offered, completely separate from the garage, and I live less than 10 minutes away if there's ever an emergency. Morgan turned to Sam, seeking an ally. This is absurd. Tell him Sam. Sam shifted uncomfortably. Sir, with proper security measures in place, the arrangement could be workable. We could install a monitoring system, ensure the apartment is secure. Morgan stared at his security chief in disbelief. You can't be serious. Elizabeth is speaking, sir, Sam said quietly. for the first time in 3 years. That fact alone suggests this environment has been more therapeutic than any facility she's attended. Johnny, who had been following the adult conversation with unusual attentiveness, tugged at Elizabeth's sleeve. "If you lived upstairs, you could help me with my cars every day," he said with the simple logic of childhood. "And Dad could teach you about engines. He's the best teacher." Elizabeth smiled down at him, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "I'd like that, Johnny." Her voice was growing more natural with each exchange, as though long dormant pathways were reawakening. Morgan watched this interaction, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked to the corner of the garage where Johnny's model car display stood. He studied it for a long moment, taking in the careful organization, the detailed information cards, bearing Elizabeth's elegant handwriting, alongside Johnny's enthusiastic facts. "You did this together?" he asked, glancing back at Elizabeth and Johnny. Johnny nodded eagerly. "Elizabeth made it so much better. She knows how to make the cars look like they're actually moving in her drawings. And she helped me organize them by historical importance, not just by year." Morgan picked up the museum-quality Mustang model Elizabeth had given Johnny, examining it with unexpected care. "This is the model you're restoring," he said to Frank, nodding toward the half-finished fastback. "Yes, sir," Frank confirmed. "Been working on it for about 3 years now. Johnny helps me on weekends." Morgan replaced the model carefully, then turned to face Elizabeth. "You really want this? To live above a garage in rural Pennsylvania? What, learn auto mechanics?" Elizabeth approached her father, standing straight and meeting his gaze directly. "I want to find out who I am now, Dad. Not who I was before the accident. Not who the doctors think I should be. Just me. Whoever that turns out to be." The vulnerability in her voice seemed to reach Morgan in a way that arguments and confrontation had not. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps seeing for the first time not the traumatized 14-year-old who had stopped speaking, but the young woman she had become. "1 month," he said finally, his voice tight with reluctant concession. "A trial period, with conditions. Sam will oversee security arrangements. You'll check in with me daily, and you'll continue with therapy outpatient with a local provider of your choosing." Elizabeth considered these terms, then nodded. "Agreed, but I choose the therapist. And no more residential facilities unless I consent." Morgan's jaw tightened at his daughter's negotiation, but he gave a curt nod. "Provided you remain stable and continue to show progress." It wasn't a wholehearted endorsement, but it was a beginning. Frank watched as father and daughter regarded each other across the gulf of 3 years of silence and misunderstanding, taking the first tentative steps toward a new kind of relationship. Johnny, oblivious to the emotional complexity of the moment, tugged at Frank's sleeve. "Does this mean Elizabeth is going to live upstairs, Dad? Can we show her the apartment right now?" Frank ruffled his son's hair, grateful for his straightforward enthusiasm. "Let's give Elizabeth and her father a few minutes to talk, buddy. Then we can show her the apartment." As Johnny returned to his model cars, Frank stepped back, giving the Morgan space for a conversation long overdue. He caught Sam's eye across the garage, and the security man gave him a subtle nod of acknowledgement, perhaps even approval. Frank didn't know what the coming weeks would bring. Elizabeth's recovery wouldn't be simple or linear. Harrison Morgan wouldn't easily relinquish control of his daughter's life. And the garage that had been Frank and Johnny's private sanctuary would be forever changed by the presence of the young woman who had found her voice within its walls. But as he watched Elizabeth speaking softly with her father, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, Frank felt the same satisfaction he experienced when restoring a classic car. The knowledge that sometimes with patience and the right tools, what seems irreparably broken can find its way back to wholeness again. Not the same as before, perhaps, but whole in its own way. And sometimes Frank knew that was enough.